Hi, good morning one and all. Today the topic is about orbital fractures. What are these orbital fractures? Now, orbit, as you see, is a component of the middle third of the face. You have the nose, the maxilla, the orbit, the zygoma. Okay. Now we're moving on to describe the orbital compartment. The orbital compartment per se is composed of numerous bones. One of the complex, as an undergraduate, it's very difficult to think, oh my God, how many bones are there? How do I remember all of this? How is this mom expecting me to remember all of this? Okay, it's pretty easy, guys. Anatomy is very, very easy as long as you apply your mind to it, okay? So this is your frontal process, okay? That's a frontal process. This is your maxilla. The maxilla has a projection that goes into the frontal process. So that's the frontal process of the maxilla. Then you have the medial wall of the orbit. Then you have the big chunky bone, which we call as a zygoma. Okay, it's a zygomatic bone. Now, nasal bones are here, and posterior to the nasal bone, we have the ethmoid bones. Remember, when we're talking about the sagittal section of the maxilla, we described about the concave, the naso-ethmoidal complex. Okay, so you have the nasal ethmoidal complexes there. Okay, whenever you remember the nasal bone, always think this nose soft tissue that is there is only soft tissue. Here is only cartilage. The bone is only up here. So posterior to the nasal bone, posterior, inferior and superior, you have the ethmoidal bone. The ethmoidal bone then has all its perpendicular plate and all that. Then on to the lateral aspect of that, you have the lacrimal bone. Then posteriorly, you have the sphenoidal bone, which actually forms a part of the cranial base. You have the lesser wing of sphenoid bone and the greater wing of the sphenoid bone. Then you have the palatine bone. Palatine bone is a very interesting bone. It sends a small, like the ethmoidal, from the palate, it sends a small perpendicular plate to go into the orbit. A small portion of that now is in the orbit, which forms the perpendicular plate of the palatine bone. Okay, so when you're looking at this picture here, all right, now we know that this is the nasal complex. This is the nasal bone. This portion here is the nasal bone. We know this is the foramen, infraorbital foramen. So whoever gives you a picture like that, without any of this, if all this is not marked, okay, none of this is marked, you're looking at the picture and you're thinking, okay, this is the nasal bone, that's the glabellar portion here for me. So that's the nasal bone for me, okay. That's the infraorbital foramen there. Okay, that's infraorbital foramen. If that is the infraorbital foramen, then this has to be the supraorbital notch. So this has to be the supraorbital margin and this has to be the infraorbital margin. So this will become, because it's close to the nose, this becomes the medial wall of the orbit. This becomes the lateral wall of the orbit. Okay. Now when we're going more closer inside, now this portion here, this particular hole here, that's the optic canal. Remember, your optic nerve comes from your on either side of the anterior clinoid process. You have a small hole from the anterior cranial base, and that is the optic canal, and then it comes and opens as the optic foramen, which transmits the optic nerve, continuation of the brain, and the olfactory and the optic, your cranial nerves. Okay, so that is your optic nerve. Now you have two fissures. The one that is on the inferior aspect is called the inferior orbit. Look at this. This is the inferior orbital fissure and this is your superior orbital fissure. That's your superior orbital fissure. Now, when I talked about the Lefort fractures, I mentioned about the superior orbital fissure syndrome. We said the superior orbital fissure transmits most of the nerves which are going to the orbit. You know, the orbit per se is being completely, it's like a, his orbit is lying happily down on a sack, okay? It's lying happily on a sack. It is being suspended with a suspensory ligament of Lockwood and it is like a hung sack. It's been there, okay? And the anterior portion, which is what you see here, you have the sclera, the cornea, all that stuff. At the back, you have the optic nerve. In between these, on either side, it's again completely covered by the suspensory ligament of Lockwood, and the muscles that are attached to the orbit suspend the orbit. The eye, is not fixed to the orbital bone. Please remember that. I know you guys read this in detail in your first year in anatomy, but here in your final year, it is final year and your post-graduation when you're looking at it, it is nothing to do with the anatomy. It's the application of the anatomy. But to understand the application, you need to know the anatomy well. That is why I'm emphasizing here. When you're looking at the orbit per se, you have the eye sitting inside and a sac and it is happily enjoying it stay there. Now, on the top, the superior aspect, the bone compartment is your superior orbital margin. This is your inferior orbital margin. That's the inferior orbital margin. Now, in the inferior orbital margin, you have the inferior orbital fissure. Here, you have the superior orbital fissure. And this is your optic foramen. Okay. Now,